So in this talk, I will focus on part of my PhD results that were recently published in a paper in tectonics, but I will also incorporate them with more complementary results to cover a few of the main aims of my PhD project. So, as Luke already introduced, the Earth Dynamic Research Group at Curtin University that I joined during my PhD, its main focus is advancing the understanding of Preplangean supercontinent existence, configuration, and evolution by expanding the paleomagnetic and geological records to improve the palaeotectonic models of ancient supercontinents. And my PhD focused on the oldest supercontinent known today as Nuna or Columbia. In particular, focused on understanding how Australia was involved in Nuna configuration during Proterozoic. And so here I show just only a few examples of the most recent paleotectonic models for the supercontinent Nuna between 165 and 155 billion years. And all these models feature a connection between Northeast Australia and Northwest Laurentia. And even if Nuna configuration and the timing of its assembly it's still controversial, Northeast Australia possibly is always in the core of Nuna during Proterozoic. So then we zoom in and we have a look at Northeast Australia. And there are 5 main Proterozoic inliers which are now part of the North Australian Craton, edged by the Tasman line to the east. And in particular, the western Mount Isa Inlier, and then the eastern Georgetown Inlier, and smaller northern inliers in northeast Queensland. So recent work from our group suggested that the oldest sedimentary rocks were likely sourced from the Laurentian Craton, which is here in green, and also garnet geochronology and thermodynamic modeling documented simultaneous metamorphic evolution between the Mount Isa Inlier in purple and the Georgetown Inlier in green at 1.60 billion years, corresponding to an upper and lower plate environment respectively. Thus, it was argued that the Georgetown Inlier, which is in orange in this left-hand figure, was part of the Laurentian Craton and accreted to the North Australian Craton at 1.60 billion years, reflecting the assembly of the supercontinent Nuna. Okay. So therefore, the motivation of this project lies in understanding the orogenic character, the cross-polar architecture, and the tectonic processes associated to this collisional event in Northeast Australia, and in particular between the North Australian Craton, the Georgetown Inlier is crucial to test this proposed link, both for the largest exposure of Precambrian rocks at the edge of the North Australian Craton, also because of its poorly constrained tectonic evolution within the region and also globally. So to do that, I combined a multi-scale, not sure why it doesn't go, there you go, petrostructural method within a multidisciplinary approach, which combined petrostructural mapping with structural and microstructural analysis, mineral and trace element, major and trace element mineral chemistry, thermodynamic modeling, and multi-method geochronology. So between these different components, today I'm going to focus on the petrostructural mapping and the structural and microstructural analysis by combining it with petrological and geochronological data that were published early this year in another paper in Journal of Metamorphic Geology. So let's take a closer look at the Georgetown Inlier, which is formed by a paleoproterozoic sedimentary sequence, almost continuously preserved from the upper to the lower part, from the west to the southeast. The lower part of the sequence was intruded by mafic sills and dikes, represented in green in this map. And then the whole inlier was deformed and metamorphosed and intruded by 1550 billion years old plutons associated with extrusive volcanic rocks which kept the sea. We identified and distinguished three main domains or regions: the western domain, which is defined by low-grade green schist fractures phyllite, where the sedimentary structure are still preserved; a central domain, where garnet and staurolite schists are locally preserved within dominant high-grade rocks associated with granites; and the eastern domain, which is a migmatitic complex characterized by the extensive partial melting. Then, if we look at the metamorphic map on the right-hand side of the slide, the Georgetown Inlier was looked at as a crustal section of a Mesoproterozoic origin, where from green schist patches to upper green schist patches metamorphism was recorded as and interpreted as a metamorphic gradient, and therefore as a single tectono-metamorphic unit. Considering the heterogeneity of metamorphism and of deformation and the scale of this inlier, however, it is unlikely that it recorded an homogeneous metamorphic evolution everywhere. So a few years later, Bogen, Hansen, and Chian and co-authors challenged the idea of one single metamorphic gradient by identifying two main metamorphic stages, medium pressure and temperature stage and a higher temperature metamorphic stage, but didn't link that with the fabric at the inlier scale, the metamorphic stages were constrained in age, which was then added by Chihan a few years later, who dated these two metamorphic domains in this central area of the Georgetown Inlier. So this metamorphic evolution was localized in one particular region of the Inlier. So our first goal was to extend the metamorphic study to different areas in order to understand whether different metamorphic evolution were recorded within the Inlier and more than one tectono-metamorphic unit was preserved. So by combining multiple pressure and temperature, deformation and time path within the Inlier, we identified three main metamorphic domains recording different metamorphic evolution and two main distinct metamorphic stages. So using lutetium hafnium in garnet corroborated by the uranium lead in monazite, we precisely dated a first metamorphic stage M1 at 1600 million years. That is locally preserved in garnet and staurolite schist in the central domain under medium amphibolite fracture conditions. The S1 fabric that recorded this structure is pervasively recorded in the western domain under green schist fracture conditions. Then a second metamorphic event, M2, was dated at 1550 million years and was associated with the development of a composite fabric, S2, recorded under medium to upper amphibolite fracture condition in the central domain and upper to granulite fracture condition in the eastern domain, where was respectively associated with granitic sheets in the central domain and extensive partial melting in the eastern domain. So the transition between the M1 event and then second metamorphic event recorded the compression from about 8 kilobar to 5 kilobar, which marks a clear tectonic distinction between a Barrovian type of metamorphism and a Bushan type thermal event. So we have, just to summarize, a western domain recording at 1600 million years, the first deformation event at shallow crustal level, and the central and the eastern domain recording the 1550 thermal event at medium to upper crustal, to lower crustal level. Sorry. So after having identified this two-stage metamorphic evolution for the Georgetown Inlier, we had to revise and extend our understanding of the structural history within the Inlier and link it with the metamorphic evolution. So back in the early 80s, Bell and Rubenas did a detailed microstructural study in the central domain, where they described the microstructural development of a dominant regional fabric as a progressive deformation during prograde metamorphism in 6 stages. However, this detailed work didn't address the macro-scale structure at the layer scale, as it was focused mainly on microstructural processes. Few years later, Qian and others applied in the central region the foliation intersection axis or FIA approach. Briefly, for who is not familiar with it, the FIA measurement technique represents the study of accumulation hinges and or intersecting multiple foliation that are trapped in non-rotating porphyroblasts. So Chihan and co-authors applied this method where the FIA basically record crustal the FIA method record crustal shortening, bulk shortening direction orthogonal to the FIA events that were identified. So in these cases, Qian and co-authors identified 4 main FIA's events from microstructural study in garnet and sterolite porphyroblast in the central area, which led to some controversial tectonothermal interpretation in the region, and we will come back to it in the last part of the talk. So basically, we applied this multi-method petrostructural approach to revise the concept between episodic and progressive deformation in the area and the deformation history within the Georgetown Inlier. So regional mapping in the Western domain has allowed the identification of the original orientation of D1 structure to be determined as north-northeast striking. The geometry of these folds as upright and slightly inclined, and the steepness of the associated S1 fabric indicates that this structure developed under compressive tectonic regime within a dominant east-west shortening direction. Locally, the north-northeast striking fabric preserved interfoliation isoclinal folds, which suggests that a more complex nature of this apparent simple cleavage. Locally, in the vicinity of the granites that are in the central domain, the S1 fabric is statically overprinted by randomly oriented andaluzite crystals. So in this area in particular, the original orientation of the S1 fabric is progressively reoriented southwards by east-west structures that are associated with the D3 deformation event. On the other hand, in the adjacent central domain, 1600 million years D1 associated structures are preserved only as relics, and namely a composite fabric S1 that we introduced earlier, characterized by S1A and S1B, developed under medium amphibolite such conditions, and is associated with bimodal lineation, which might reflect 2 sets of D1 linear structure associated with this composite fabric, or might represent the effect of subsequent deformation events D2 in the area, which also developed north-south striking structure, but is associated with east-west extension. On the other hand, in the eastern domain, no structure associated to this 1600 D1 event were recognized. The second deformation event, dated at 1550 million years, is instead pervasively recorded in the central and in the eastern domain. So in the eastern domain is expressed in an S2 high-grade fabric, which is actual planar fabric of recumbent isoclinal F2 folds which are defined by an older differentiated fabric, which is commonly obliterated during magmatization. And S2 is regionally folded, again by east-west trending folds, but its original north-south orientation is preserved within F3 hinges. Indeed, unfolding the dominant east-west trending F3 folds indicates that the folded S2 surface was originally north-south striking and coincide with the S2 enveloping surface. Here, S2 is associated with a southeast plunging lineation, and the scattered gilded distribution of this lineation indicates the F2 folds are non-cylindrical and have been then refolded by the late D3 deformation event. So the D2 structure and S2 is associated also with symmetrical and asymmetrical extensional structures such as boudinage of leucocratic materials and SC structures that suggest both top to the west shear sands and that the melt was segregated during the development of the S2 foliation. In the adjacent central domain, the transition between the D1 and D2 structures was identified in this region, where in this location, a shallow west dipping S2 fabric in thin section reveals an older fabric in the low strain domains. And in this transition zone, the S2 fabric is a differentiated fabric which truncates the D1 structure at high angle, as you can see from this cross section. So where this truncation occurs, the S2 fabric becomes more pervasive and more organizing going towards the east, where is associated with increasing granitic sheets and partial melting of the metasedimentary rocks. So this dominant S2 fabric is a high-grade foliation, axial planar fabric of isocliner recumbent folds, and is associated again with a southeast plunging lineation, as you can see up here. So in the field it's pretty clear that the progressive development of this complex fabric is occur at high grade conditions and under continuous melt segregation. Finally, the D3 event is the youngest deformation event, which is recorded at different scale and represents the present day structural pattern of the inlier. So this structure are east-west trending folds, open upright folds, and are associated with the development of quite steep retrograde fabric. In the high strain D3 zone, the earlier structure are not only reoriented, but most of the time are transposed and obliterated. Okay, so in summary, we identified 3 distinct deformation events associated with the development of progressive composite fabrics. In the 1600s, the first deformation event, northeast striking structure developed, compressional structure developed associated to east-west shortening, and were identified at Grinches-Patches condition in the western domain and at a mid-amphibolite condition in the central domain. The second deformation event, D2, dated at 1550 million years, is extensively recorded in the central and in the eastern domain, but not in the western domain. And we interpreted this dichotomy to reflect the presence of a tectonic contact between the western and the central and eastern domain. Indeed, the progressive development of the two structure during melt segregation, as we said, and the symmetrical and asymmetrical extensional structure suggest that the second deformation event developed associated with ductile and shear structure, reflecting a kilometric thick zone of high heterogeneous strain, as illustrated by this very complex fold structure in a region of mid-crustal deformation, and which we identified as a crustal scale extensional detachment zone, reflected by the central and the eastern domain. So this interpreted west dipping crustal detachment zone is consistent also with dominant west dipping structure reaching middle to lower crustal levels that were imaged in a deep seismic profile published by Korsch and co-authors in 2012. Therefore, this D2 deformation event is inferred to develop during post-collisional east-west oriented expansional stage associated with this detachment zone that accommodates crustal melting and exhumation of deeper crustal level. And finally, the D3 deformation event developed east-west, striking F3 folds under retrograde conditions and reflects the exhumation of the terrain under north-south shortening direction. So consequently, we also revisited the view of one single structural metamorphic unit and identified at least two tectono-metamorphic units, and namely the western upper crustal domain and the central and eastern mid to lower crustal domain, juxtaposed by a crustal scale detachment zone. So now if we dive back into the progressive crenulation cleavage development concept applied by Bell and Rubenach in the 80s, we have evaluated these results obtained based on our outcomes. So from our results, we conclude that a combination of progressive deformation characterized by the 1600 S1 fabric and the 1550 S2 fabric and episodic deformation with two distinct D1 and D2 deformation events characterize the tectonothermal evolution of this polydeform terrain. This sequence contrasts with Bell and Rubenach model, which proposed a diachronous growth of porphyroblastic sequence during 6 stages of progressive development of one dominant deformation during prograde metamorphism. Instead, in our contribution, we suggest that 6 stages of progressive cleavage development of Bell and Rubenach occurred twice during 2 distinct deformation events, D1 and D2. Secondly, we evaluated the concept of FIA method applied in the early 2000s by Sheehan and co-authors, and few are the key points of differences between our results and the previous study. So very few are the trends that could be correlated with the regional structures. And in particular, according to the FIA analysis, the east-west folds in the central domain predated the growth of porphyroblasts, of garnet and sterlite porphyroblasts. However, the east-west trending folds, according to our study, form last and during retrograde metamorphism. Also, the north trending FIA identified at about 1600 billion years by Sheehan and co-authors resembled the 1550 north striking D2 structures associated with the development of the high-grade S2 fabric. However, this was dated 1550 million years and not at 1600 million years. And last, the FIA northeast striking FIA4 resemble the D2 structure identified in the western domain in this study that, however, were associated with were dated at 1600 million years and not at 1550 million years. So the phi analysis in Georgetown Inlier was restricted to the central domain where the T2 and M2 high strain mid-crustal extensional ductal shear zone was identified in the study. And none of the 1550 high-grade deformation events were identified by the FIA study, nor was the later D3 east-west striking event, nor the northeast trending D1 event, as neither of those events was captured in porphyroblast inclusion trails. So therefore, we conclude that the FIA approach is potentially a valid approach for unraveling the early structural history of a region, because porphyroblasts do not necessarily rotate as the surrounding matrix progressively deforms, as was shown by recent publication. However, our regional structural analysis of the Georgetown Inlier illustrates some limitation of this approach, and therefore we suggest that a multidisciplinary, multiscale analysis at different crustal levels is required to fully understand the tectono-metamorphic evolution of a polydeformed terrain. So we conclude that in the Georgetown Inlier preserves different stages of the Mesoproterozoic orogenesis related to the final assembly of the supercontinent Nuna. The 1600 continental collision between the Georgetown and the Mount Isa Inlier was associated with east-west directed shortening, and this crustal architecture, which is typical of collisional origins, was interpreted by Porto and co-authors as the Georgetown was the westward leading edge of the Laurentian craton at 1600 million years, and that collided towards the overriding Mount Isa Inlier that was part of the North Australian plate. This event was followed by an east-west extensional stage at 1550 million years, where the exhumation of 30 kilometers of crust was accommodated by asymmetrical D2 extensional detachment zone, which juxtaposed the 1600 medium pressure and medium temperature relics in the central domain to the 1600 upper crustal western domain. So during this event, high-grade mid to lower crustal level were exhumed and associated with granitic sheets granitic sheets along this detachment fault. So soon after the 1550 million years event, the Georgetown Inlier underwent north-south shortening associated with exhumation of the whole terrain under green sheets to lower amphibolite conditions. And this stage in the Georgetown Inlier was related to extensive hydrothermal activity, and it was contemporaneous with continuous magmatic activity in the neighboring Mount Isa Inlier. Okay, so just the conclusions. So the 1600 first deformation event associated to north striking compressional structures developed during east-west shortening associated with the final assembly of the supercontinent Nuna. The 1550 post-collisional extension along the east-west stress field is related to development of a crustal scale detachment zone in the Laurentian lower plate. And then we identified at least two tectono-metamorphic units, the western upper crustal domain, juxtaposed to the central and the eastern mid to lower crustal domain along the crustal scale detachment zone. And we conclude that the 6 stages of progressive deformation in the Georgetown occurred twice and during 2 distinct deformation events. And the phi approach has to be combined with structural and petrographic observation at different scales within the studied origin. So if you want to know a bit more, please check out my publication in the Journal of Metamorphic Geology and in Tectonics. And I take also actually the opportunity to mention my latest paper in contribution to mineralogy and petrology, where we contributed to the long-lasting discussion of the reliability of zircon and monazite thermometry, coupled with thermodynamic modeling to constrain the petrogenetic models of granitic magmatism. Thank you.